Hello, I'm Tony Inadio, and welcome to this lecture on the Hudson River and its valley. The lectures in this course won't be very fancy. It's just going to be me talking in front of a bunch of books. But there'll be one in each module, along with a list of websites that you can visit, some articles to read in the form of PDF or Word, and there may or may not be a PowerPoint. There's also a discussion question, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. There's a lot of reading available for the course. You have suggested titles in the learning contract or the websites and the articles. You'll have to decide which of that reading will be most useful to you. And the best way to do that is to have the questions that you need to answer in mind. For example, there are two essay questions. One asks you to look at the connection between commerce and the arts. So for example, if you were going to do literature, you might not want to read all of the articles on architecture. You can read them, but they might not be useful to your essay topic. And then the last essay is to choose a locality or a region and discuss how the Hudson River and its valley contributed to its identity. There are also discussion questions in each module, and each of them requires you to write a paragraph, and then you have to write a response paragraph to the posts of two other students. In each of these, what I'm looking for is for you to answer the questions how, why, what does this mean? In other words, don't just tell me what happened in history. We want to provide some analysis. And when you respond to those posts of other students, what I'm looking for is either you might disagree with them and then explain why, or you could take a point that they made and expand on it. What I don't want is for you to say, oh, very good post. I like how you said blah, 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 blah. And then you said blah, 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 blah. I want, some substance. And if you do that, then you'll get a good grade. Essentially, what I want you to do is the work of an historian. When we do our work, we look at lots of evidence. There's tons of it. And we know we can't use it all. And in fact, not all of it is even necessary. So you have to be able to look at the evidence and make those decisions. And you won't always get it right. Sometimes you will think something isn't very useful, and later on you're going to have to go back and revisit it. So don't get too caught up in it, but what I want you to do is to keep those things in mind as you do the reading. So you do not have to read all of the books, you do not have to read every word on all of those websites, and you don't have to read every single one of the articles. If you can set aside maybe an hour or two each day for the course, that would be great. And it would be even better if, when you're not specifically working on the course, that you might be thinking about it if you're driving your car or something like that. The more work you put in, the better you will do. So what we're going to do in these videos is look at the history, and the way I'm going to do this is to provide the type of connections that I'm looking for. History is about integration. We want to know how things fit together, and we want to know how and why they fit together. So as we look at this first section on the Dutch and how they settled the New World, we have to really look at Europe and the New World. The New World is discovered by Columbus in 1492, and pretty soon the European powers want to find out what is here. They all have different reasons, they all have different ways of doing this. The Spanish exploited a lot of the wealth, whereas the English had a mind to colonize. The Dutch, in a sense, were in between that. They wanted to make money, and they weren't really that interested in colonization. But we have to look a little bit at who the Dutch were. They formed the Netherlands out of provinces in Northern Europe. And characteristic of those provinces is that a lot of the land is below sea level. So they have to deal with water. It's very much a part of their life. There's also an issue of religion. They're largely Protestant. And this brings about an 80-year war with Spain. Although they're also very tolerant of other religions, which attracts a lot of the best and the brightest to the Netherlands. They also do not have a lot of resources, a lot of natural resources. They have a lot of water, that's for sure. But a lot of the land, or a lot of their sort of territory, the water is only, 2 to 3 feet deep. And they realize if they could figure out a way to get rid of that water, they'd have a lot more land. And so they develop these canals and embankments. They develop windmills to pump water, and eventually they're able to literally reclaim lots of land. And when you actually create the land that you're living on, you have a very deep connection to it. All of that water made the Dutch, of necessity, very good shipbuilders, very good navigators, and they're also very good map makers. If you look at a lot of Dutch art, you'll see, maps on the wall as if they were there for art, even though they're very valuable. And of course, lots of European nations regarded the maps that were made of the New World as state secrets. So these are very, very important. The Dutch, in order to explore the New World, it's very expensive to do this. You have to have a ship and crew and so on. So the Dutch formed companies. In particular, we're going to look at the Dutch West India Company. It was set up to try to find a better way to get to the East, or the Orient. So instead of going, around Europe and then down around Africa and so on, they wanted to sail in the other direction. So the fabled Northwest Passage, was a promise of riches to those who could discover it. So in 1609, the Dutch West India Company hires an Englishman, Henry Hudson, to find this passage. Now he's supposed to go north, but he ends up going in a different direction and sails up the river that now bears his name. He thought that this could possibly be that passage. He wasn't the first person to discover it. Other explorers had seen it and probably had also sailed up it, but the records did not survive. Hudson's records survived. So he sails his ship, the Half Moon, up the river, and they get as far as Albany, Cohoes, around there, because then there's the Cohoes Falls, and ships can't go beyond that. So he realizes he has to go back. So on his way back, he ends up getting stranded in England. They seize everything, but eventually word gets back to the Netherlands, and pretty soon they're going to establish their foothold. It's technically land claimed by England because they had settled in the Chesapeake Bay and in the Massachusetts Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is settled similarly to the Dutch for commercial purposes. Although it didn't pan out the way that they wanted it to, eventually tobacco becomes its major export. Whereas in the Massachusetts Bay colony, those settlers came to practice their own religion freely. They did not come for religious freedom. They didn't believe in religious freedom. Their main export was cod. So in between that is the Hudson River Valley, and of course this is claimed by England, but it's sort of like, a person could claim the moon. as their own. But if you can't get there and you can't stop people from getting there, then, you know, you don't have much of a claim. So England, you know, could nominally claim it, but the Dutch established their foothold there. They called the river the Mauritius, or the Noord River, for North River, because it went north. We're going to look at the river in terms of its utility and also as an aesthetic symbol. And we'll get to all that later. I'm not going to explain all that now. So at the time that the Dutch are establishing their foothold, the English are also beginning to thrive in the New World. And so there's going to be some clashes. And one of the things that we'll see is that conflicts in Europe almost always spilled over into the New World, and sometimes vice versa. So we always have to consider that sort of European context as we try to understand what's going on. So the Dutch establish a fort that they call Fort Nassau in 1614. It's named after the House of Orange-Nassau. Today, the location of that fort today is the Port of Albany, if you're familiar with the area or not. But in 1617, it's flooded. They rebuild, and then it's flooded again. In 1624, they'll build another fort on higher ground that they will call Fort Orange. These are essentially trading outposts, and what they're after are pelts, particularly beaver pelts, although there are other types of fur animals as well. So the Dutch are really, you know, they see this as a commercial venture, and, you know, creature comforts aren't really high on the list. But they realize that some settlement has to take place. And so the Dutch something in 1629 known as the Charter of Freedoms and Exemptions, which will grant land to people who
were able to populate it with 50 or more persons over the age of 15. And what you would get is either 8 miles on each side of the river or 16 miles on one side of the river. The whole notion of settlement takes a really, really long time to take hold. In fact, the early settlers literally dug holes into the ground and lived there. I mean, basically in a pit or a dugout until, you know, years later they could build a home over the top of it. The whole venture then, at least according to some people, depended on farming. In particular, one of the investors, there are a board of directors of 19 people, and one of them is named Kilian van Rensselaer. And so he'll set up this, what's known as a patroonship. It's a derivation of the word patron. So the patroon essentially owns the land, although he has certain responsibilities himself. He has a responsibility to the company. He has to people it with 50 people. It has to be economically viable. But also, Van Rensselaer not only establishes this patroonship, known as Rensselaerwyck, but he then purchases additional land from Indians, both as a way to increase his land holdings and to establish relations with the Indians, because right from the beginning, whether it's the English, the French, the Dutch, there's always conflicts between them and the Indians. Of course, the Indians are also fighting amongst themselves, and the Europeans are fighting amongst themselves. So there's a lot of conflict to go around. But the patroon was responsible for providing land for, he had to sort of clear the land for farming, or at least arrange for it to be cleared. Kilian van Rensselaer never actually set foot in the New World. But they would have to provide tools, livestock, which is very difficult because livestock require lots of water and food on the voyage over, and it was just very, very difficult to transport them. But he'd also have to build barns and sawmills and grist mills, churches and schools, etc. And then the way it worked is that half of your production would go to the patroon and then half would go to you. But if you were going to sell it, you had to at least first offer it to the patroon and then you could go make your money. But Van Rensselaer realized that farming was really a key here, that if people couldn't cultivate the land to survive, the beaver trade in pelts wasn't going to sustain them. And then once the whole thing was profitable, then the patroon was expected to share the profits. We don't know how well that worked out. The English, on the other hand, as they colonized the New World, had joint stock companies, which the Dutch, they actually got the idea from the Dutch. The Dutch also, used these, although the English were much more interested in colonization, whereas, as I said, the Dutch are more interested in the commercial venture. For the English, you've got tobacco and cod, but and of course, to do the work, they have indentured servants. If you couldn't afford the trip over, then you would simply give up certain number of years of your labor for passage, and you became known as an indentured servant. But in 1619, a Dutch ship arrives in the Chesapeake Bay with some 20 African slaves. And this is really the beginning of slavery in the New World. And the Dutch were very, very active slave traders, not only to the English, but also in the place that they called the New Netherlands. And at the head of the river, they refer to what we call New York City as New Amsterdam. But up the river, they had established this fort, Fort Orange, which today is now occupied by the Highway 787 and State Street and Broadway and the Dunn Memorial Bridge. So it's all been, the site has all been obliterated. But they named the place Beaverback, or the place of the beaver, which indicates just how much that trade meant to them. Fort Orange, however, had been established before Van Rensselaer's patent. So eventually the fort in Beaverwick, as some people call it, will become this sort of independent entity. But as they sail up and down the river, the Dutch were really impressed with what they saw as a landscape of abundance. There were, lots of animals, lots of lumber, lots of good farmland, and lots of natural beauty. So this was something that, they note in their journals and very important to them. Downriver, however, you have a number of directors sent forth by the company to manage the affairs of their settlement. The first one was Peter Minuit, who in 1624 makes what most people say is one of the greatest landscape or real estate deals in history. He buys Manhattan Island for about $24. You could also look at this in a different way. The Indians did not really think that they owned that land. And so when someone is going to offer them some stuff for it, they're thinking, well, yeah, sure, we'll take the stuff and yeah, you can have that. If they don't think they own it, then they might have been getting the better end of the deal. And of course, we only think that this is such a great deal because of how valuable land is in Manhattan. And one of the reasons why land is so valuable in Manhattan has a lot to do with the Hudson River and then later the Erie Canal. So we'll get to that a little bit later on. So the directors, Peter Minuit is the first director. The last director is Peter Stuyvesant. And in between them, there are some rather suspect directors who didn't do a very good job. In addition, you're dealing with people as they come to the New World. And of course, once the economics start working, then you want more and more people to come here. And of course, to get people to come here, you have to entice them. So they kind of liberalize property, you know, making it a little easier for people to obtain property. But the people who are coming here, you know, aren't people of really high moral standing. You know, they like to drink, and there's a lot of whoring and prostitution and street brawling and, you know, outright theft and what have you. There's, you know, constant fights with the Indians, constant fights amongst themselves, you know. There's a lot of chaos. Peter Stuyvesant arrives in 1647, and it's already a very polyglot society. I mean, this kind of characterizes New York even to this very day. And he's got to impose some kind of order. And in addition, the Dutch West India Company had made a lot of money privateering on the high seas, you know, raiding Spanish ships and whatnot. And there's this war that goes on in Europe. There's the 80 Years' War between the Netherlands and Spain, and then there's the 30 Years' War. In 1648, it all comes to an end with the what's called the Peace of Westphalia, the Treaty of Westphalia, which establishes diplomatic relations amongst the European powers. They would try to settle their differences diplomatically. They would leave religion to, you know, eat treaties and so on. So that meant an end to the era of privateering. So it was
a source of income that they could no longer count on. And the colony is expensive to maintain as well. So this is the world in which Stuyvesant sort of, you know, enters. And of course, he's got to deal with defenses. And one of the things he does is he builds a ditch and a rampart from the East River to the North River. And that little line across Manhattan Island today is known as Wall Street. The people that he's dealing with try to emulate their lives in Europe, which isn't very surprising. And that's why we really have to understand, you know, who these people were, what is the history of Europe, and that will allow us to understand the history of the New World a little bit better. In addition, you have a lot of religious diversity, even though there are lots of attempts to kind of curb religious diversity. Particularly in New England, as I mentioned, you know, the Puritans were not interested in religious freedom. But you have these Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they're constantly pushing westward. And pretty soon they're pushing up against the New Netherlands. And so when their leader, John Winthrop, and the leader of the New Netherlands, Peter Stuyvesant, will come to an agreement, a sort of diplomatic agreement. There's also a lot of conflict in Europe between England and the Netherlands, and they will fight a series of 3 wars in the 17th century. They're known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Pretty much the Netherlands will win each one of these wars, but it's the second one that's really important to us. It was begun when the English attacked New Amsterdam. And Stuyvesant really didn't have enough support, and he certainly didn't have enough defense to take on the English. And he sort of knew this, and he has to surrender the New Netherlands and New Amsterdam to the English. Eventually, it will be ratified in a treaty as well. So what we might ask ourselves is, you know, why did they just give this up? I mean, in the 3 Anglo-Dutch wars, this is really the only thing that the Dutch lose. And again, today we know it is very valuable, so we think, wow, they really made a mistake here. But to the Dutch, this was a very expensive colony to maintain. And eventually the Dutch West India Company will go bankrupt.
By now there are about 9,000 people living in this territory. So what do you do with all of that? Although the territory was retaken by the Dutch in 1673 to 1674, but then the English will take it back over. What's really interesting about all of this is that after the Second Anglo-Dutch War, Charles II is the King of England. His brother is the Duke of York and the Duke of Albany. His name is James. He will become James II after Charles II dies. While this Second War happens, James offers his daughter Mary to the Stadtholder of the Netherlands, William, of the House of Orange. So William and Mary will marry. But then in 1688, when James II, who was childless, and to the great dismay of the Protestants in England, he was very Catholic, ends up having a son. Is at that point they appeal to William and Mary of the Netherlands to please invade England, which they do, and James is unable to muster up enough support. He has to flee, and so William and Mary of the Netherlands will become King William and Mary of England. Even though the New World is now under English control, it's kind of ironic that the monarchs in England, or at least William, is from the Netherlands. What's more interesting is that even after the English take over, and they will rename the colony New York, and its northernmost outpost, Albany, after the Duke of York and the Duke of Albany, which was James, they leave the patroonships in place. And they do this for a couple of reasons. The patroonships were very well managed, and they were willing to acknowledge English authority. So as long as they were willing to do that, then to the English, they were fine with it. A new fort will be built in Albany in 1676 called Fort Frederick. And it's now the front, sort of the road in the front and this leading up to the steps of the state capitol. That's where the building originally stood. But eventually, the river that is discovered by an Englishman will start to take on his name. I mean, it took a while for the river to finally be called the Hudson River. But it's really that English takeover that makes that happen, which is kind of weird because he discovered it working for the Dutch West India Company. So the whole patroon system will stay in place, and we're going to look at it in more detail, but we're going to look at it in the next module when we talk about the English, because now this is New York, but the Dutch influence is going to continue and continues down to the present day. And we'll see how the English manage the colony of New York. And we'll see the role that the river plays in the 18th century, which is even bigger than the role it played in the 17th century. One thing we have to keep in mind, that travel up and down the river is very, very time consuming. It takes anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks. And of course, in the wintertime, it's totally impossible. So that concludes this lecture. The next time we will look at the role of the English in the Hudson River and its valley. Thanks for listening.